Good morning from London. On behalf of the Goethe-Institut London and everyone involved, I'm very excited to welcome you all from around the world to the DAOWO Sessions Artworld Prototypes. This is the final online event which looks at a set of experimental projects to reinvent the future of the art world with blockchain by investigating what can be learned from DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, working with others. Each of the previous events introduced one new progressive blockchain art prototype created by DAO teams in Berlin, Hong Kong, Johannesburg, and Minsk as part of a large international collaboration of the last 18 months. Each session aimed to address key questions about the potential of blockchain systems to decentralize power structures and to rewire the arts. Today, co-curators of the DAO Global Initiative, Penny Rafferty and Ruth Catlow, will be interviewed by curator and writer Francesca Galvin. In order to include the widest audience possible, we are pleased to welcome Dee here, who will be translating today's events into British Sign Language, and we will be using visual descriptions, which means any presenter will describe themselves and any images they use. So, I'm Katrine and I have dark hair and I'm wearing a grey jumper today. And we have Dee here with us who has blonde hair and a black top and glasses. Welcome, Dee. We have pre-recorded this session. Please do post any questions you have in the YouTube chat. Our curators are here today with us and they will reply to them in writing. As this is our final session, I would like to thank everyone who has made this project possible, all the teams and their local communities globally, as well as our brilliant curators and hosts of the sessions, Artworld Prototypes, Ruth Catlow, Artistic Director of Furtherfield, and Penny Rafferty, Writer and Researcher. I will now hand over to you, Ruth, and do please describe yourself, and thank you to you both.
Thanks, Katrin. Yes, so I'm a white woman with medium length reddy hair with glasses and a greeny gold jumper. And I'm here with Francesca Gavin and Penny Rafferty. Penny, would you like to go next?
So I'm a white woman with green eyes, freckles, and today I'm wearing a headscarf from the artist Claire Barrow and a navy blue sweater.
And I'm Francesca Gavin, or Fran as people call me. And I'm a white woman who looks a bit pasty because she hasn't been in the sun for a while, with long curly hair that's a bit fuzzy from dancing. And I'm wearing a black t-shirt, occasionally with a black cardigan when I get a bit cold.
So it's really great to have Fran here. We asked Fran to come and host an interview with Penny and I to help us to reflect both on the Artworld DAO prototype sessions that have been running for the last few weeks. And so to help us to reflect on what we've learned and also to contextualize the work that we've been doing more broadly in the art world context, and to between us come to a kind of understanding of what we think the importance of DAOs or decentralized organizations are for the art world, but also the importance of artists to the blockchain and decentralized technology space. So we're going to have an interview that we think will last somewhere between about 40 minutes. And we really look forward to also speak to you simultaneously as a non-recorded version of ourselves in the chat channel in YouTube. So here you're getting us doubled up, which I think is very good value for money. So handing over to you, Fran.
Okay, well, before we begin, I think it makes sense for those who haven't been keeping in touch with a lot of the work that you've done so far, just to give a really brief summary of what a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, is. Penny, do you want to give that a go?
Sure, or Yeah, I can do this. So basically, a decentralized autonomous organization is actually, in a way, it's a kind of blockchain-based code that implements the governance of an organization that may control its funds and resources. And I think that that's the best way to kind of just put it into a kind of quick sentence structure that's actually borrowed from Rob Meyer's blockchain glossary. But I just also want to say that, in short, what DAOs was initially is not entirely where we've come to think of DAOs as being today. So basically, a DAO allows people to exchange economic value, to kind of pool resources and form joint ventures in ways that were impossible before blockchain technology. The focus of the Artworld DAO, however, is less on the blockchain technology itself than on the properties and features enabled by decentralized autonomous organizations, which in a sense is why we thought it was so important to bring it within the context of the art world, because the global art world provides one of the strongest societal and social testbeds of digital native generations. And predominantly a DAO structure was only really kind of resonating in the tech scene at this point. And so we're kind of trying to bring it into a much more kind of diverse and intersectional community. And that's also because artists bring, of course, very strong value to the technological development space, with their kind of intrinsic motivation to address, and in a way, more than human experience, to kind of cooperate and rule break and find value and kind of question the potentiality of replacing outmoded business models into decentralized autonomous organizations, and really, instead of it going down that kind of vein, to actually purposefully kind of bring it out. So I guess in a sense, the art world DAOs that we were very interested in kind of demonstrating was more the importance of the user's role in shaping their own technological tools for themselves and their own kind of proximate decentralized communities as this kind of counterbalance to systems designed from the center that may not act in their interests. So in a way, what went from being originally presented as a decentralized autonomous organization that in a sense worked with people who could, for want of a better word, trust each other, we actually started to bring it into a more, let's say, kind of emotional, socio-political usage of this original idea of the DAO.
So, I mean, the way the structure seems to have gone over the past 6 weeks is you've been having a lot of kind of proposals made by these different groups in Minsk and Berlin and Johannesburg and Hong Kong, I think was your fourth. Do you want to tell me, for both of you, what you feel some of the kind of highlights have been over those past 4 sessions and kind of excitement that have been coming out of it? Yeah, what are the highlights for you?
Okay, I'll take this one and Penny chip in. What excited us, I think, about so this is, it's kind of one step beyond a proposal. So these are prototypes. So these are, and one of the things that excited me was actually the different formats that these took. So we see prototypes as a way to test the way something would live in the world, something the way something would live in the world with its, in this case, with its communities or with its members or users, however we want to think about it. So let's just think about the different formats that we saw explored. So with the Black Swan DAO in Trust, we saw a DAO being modeled as a Discord bot. So Discord, for those that don't know, is a community platform that's actually been used mainly at first by kind of gaming community, but basically a social media community channel. But there's you can work with the codes within these bots to automate certain actions and certain kind of membership permissions and user permissions within these online communities. And the Black Swan DAO guys at Trust in Berlin used this to test out a number of coordination problems within a small artistic community. So coordination and resource allocation problems. And what they were doing was deciding how to allocate a small amount of funding or for small kind of like micro commissions amongst their own community, and then to reflect on and test what it felt like to operate and allocate resources in that way. So we have that happening at Trust. Then Covalent Studios in South Africa, in Johannesburg, they really ran this as a community design process. So they used the idea and the framework of the DAO as a way to think through how they would formulate incentivization for collaboration and participation in their very particular context, the art context in Johannesburg. And what we got in their prototype was actually a prototype for designing a DAO and an understanding of like some of the conflicts and contradictions of thinking about artistic collaboration in this quite technical, in a technical and mechanism design way. Then the DAO as Chimera from EEEFFF in Minsk. The format we had there was a live action role play that took the realities, the political realities of Belarus, Minsk, and the decentralized organization that's actually happening on the ground there at the moment in the form of yards. So these are kind of gatherings in kind of public, small distributed public spaces in the towns that are then replicated into specially constructed digital spaces with a focus on secure, non-censored communication. So these are kind of coordination technologies that map from digital onto physical space. But so they were working with people who are living in a very particular political situation, and to think through how these coordination technologies might be viewed then through the format of a future orangery of financial technologies. So this is after, it's kind of post blockchain. So kind of using kind of future histories as a way to understand the values and people's approaches to dealing with decentralized technologies now in a very playful way, in a way that is very felt. And then finally, last week we had the Ensemble DAO from Hong Kong. And Samson Young basically took the practice of his kind of collaborative improvisatory music making and kind of looked at this through the lens of the DAO. And the thing that really excited me about that, and I think this is true of all of them, but that it really highlighted the relational aspect of the lens that artists are bringing to the DAO. So instead of emphasizing the art as a commodity or an object or as a set of things that one might own or trade or do something with, their DAO prioritized a set of actions, or instead of roles, it was actions and processes. So that like improvising, conducting were the more music specific ones. And then in the kind of more collaborative actions, we had enabling, nudging, seeding, cushioning. And so what excites me about that is that we see a kind of a formalization of artistic collaborative processes in a variety of kind of almost like instructional formats. So it's like this translation of different collaborative, very social collaborative, kind of relational collaborative artistic processes, reformatted, almost like kind of fluxus instructional works, in order to think about what they would look like if they were to be instantiated as software and then replicated and used by other people.
And obviously, as with these prototypes, and they were really very diverse, do you feel that there was progress made towards taking them to the next stage, or what areas do you think emerged as sort of that needed to be explored to take these prototypes to the next stage of functioning?
I mean, I think it definitely felt like, after speaking to the groups, that none of the projects were going to, in a way, stop there. Like, I mean, what was for me is one of the most exciting parts of the last few weeks was also just kind of like listening and hearing how, even thinking through the lens of a decentralized autonomous organization, how these artists are now completely like rethinking what it means to be part of like an interdependent model of working, and like what even should the artist be in control of, and like what should the collective be in control of, and like how does, instead of an institution or a market, platform artists, where do they want to end up? Like, where is it interesting to become participatory in relation to the cultural field? And I think that was also very interesting in relation to what a kind of topic that kind of came up quite a lot. And I think it sort of ties in with the idea of the prototype, was basically there was a lot of questions around the word power. Because, of course, in a sense, these decentralized autonomous organizations are very much coded in order to give power, not only on a kind of stewardship or guardianship level, but also on a creative level as well. And how power can also be empowering. And like, how do you have like fluid guardianship, and how do you make these prototypes that can then become potentially open sourced or forked by another collective? So you actually like become part of this translocal schema. And I think that was like what I was really excited about, and noticing quite often that after the prototype series, there has been like, even within this group of 5 prototypes, there's already like an exchange of source and code and conversation about bringing those materials and those projects into other parts of the world. And I mean, for example, I was just at Trust, who did the Black Swan project last week, and they're already now creating a new piece of software called Signet, which is a quadratic voting application, which will change the way in which people can vote on a DAO in a more kind of interdependent, socio-emotional disperse, rather than like a one vote, one win, one model, which of course like completely changes your whole concept of like what proposal goes forward and how to support your community and so forth. So I don't know, I think I like went in a million different directions.
No, but I find that one of the most obvious things that come out of this is like what the importance of decentralized power is, full stop. Because I mean, if you look at this in a political context, let's say post World War II, or in the political context of today, that often the decentralization of power is to do with preventing, let's say, a centralized idea of propaganda. That's been one of the reasons why you've had like a desire for this, or to get away from the ruling elite of power structures. So I'm really curious what you feel the importance is of that kind of fundamental shift beyond the organization, but the actual decentralization of power itself.
So I kind of my first experience of thinking about the relationship between decentralization, art and power was with the early web. So in the mid-90s, and I jokingly describe myself as a recovering web utopian, because in those early days of the web, with the flowering of free and open source software and peer-to-peer technologies and values, it really was, there was this idea that there was something inherently progressive in the kind of decentralization of power and resources. And then we had sort of the great re-centralization of the web with Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc. And so I guess personally, I came into the blockchain moment with the understanding that decentralized technologies, because they are social technologies, they are very likely always already co-opted and appropriated. So that the decentralization of technical power or computing does not automatically equate to a redistribution of wealth and power. And so I think there are many really right now there are conversations raging. I think it is not hyperbolic of me to say that, around the kind of whether it is legitimate for artists to be working in this space when the environmental impact of blockchains is currently so high. And I think my take on this is that we need that decentralized both technologies and societal formations are not going away, that the social and political organization is using new forms of decentralization every which way. We've seen that it's just been such a bizarre emergence of new kind of political moves and strategies and tactics that we've seen globally over the last 10 years, that we have to bring our whole human selves into these decentralized spaces, expressive, exchanging, working out how we can cooperate, collaborate, and protect ourselves from kind of toxic overflowings, actually. This is why we need to have not just technical people in this space, not just financiers in this space, not just corporations in this space, because we need to understand what people and more than human life forms on the ground need to thrive, and how they might thrive in spite of the fact that these technical systems exist, and learn how we might shape them together to do more than just survive them. I mean,
would you argue that this is almost a moment, with the knowledge of the way, let's say, the internet has gone from that utopian space, particularly from the mid-90s to the year 2000, even that kind of earlier moment, and this deep commodification and the deep dispersal of, you're right, financial and, let's say, worrying political corners. Do you think that awareness is coming to something like DAOs, and the awareness of how the structural importance is of getting involved before blockchain, let's say, gets usurped by what we've already learned from 20 years of the internet? Do you think that there's that we're trying to learn from our mistakes in advance, if that makes sense?
No, I think that was completely the reason why we felt it was so important to have this project now. It's very much to try to capture this moment before blockchain is then gentrified. I mean, very much what we are doing is trying to create these kind of social landscapes, not rooms with views. I mean, we know that the public realm has been tarnished. It's gendered, class, racial economic thoroughfare. And the indebted private space we cling to is kind of the same way. So I think that what me and Ruth have been battering back and forth between ourselves is this kind of argument for like a post-public, which is not exactly like a return to the public, but instead it's about liberating space in which the users kind of govern themselves in a space and holds its kind of own autonomy rather than a sovereign body that loans it to the masses until like kind of further notice. And this kind of post-public space includes both the private and the open. I guess in like a Chantal Mouffe way, it would be like this kind of both radical and plural democracy, meaning the post-public should kind of cater for a space in which like multiple struggles are also present, not just multiple creations, which I think that we also, of course, spotlighted with the series. But also these kind of emancipatory intersections can be founded within a plurality of like social agents and their fights rather than kind of isolated groups performing resistance through this kind of centrality of like a singular need. And I think that's also something, Ruth, maybe you want to chip in on this, but is something that we've been speaking about is also why we think artists and the art world should be part of this, because quite often if it's purely coming from a technological sphere, this is not exactly so perforated, or there's not so much diversity and osmosis as like the art world is a huge, I guess, ecosystem, for want of a better word. And I think that that's also extremely important to kind of strengthen this eco-citizen. That's like, I don't know, system.
Keep that.
Can I jump in on that? Because I think that I think the fact that the art world is an ecosystem of ecosystems is why it lends itself and why it brings so much value to an exploration of the decentralized autonomous organizations. So if you look at partly because artists are often based in communities and they draw on communities with very diverse kind of interaction forms. So like they need, they have audiences that they might be ticket buying audiences, but they may be participants in something, or they may be people who have come to part own something, or they may just be pure spectacle, who knows. But also then there's the studio, the whole, you've got this whole kind of production workforce. And the thing that I think it makes it especially valuable is just what has happened, especially in the kind of high art world, high art market, the hardcore financialization of art at the moment means that when we've been doing this work on DAOs and thinking about governance as well as resources, it means that we're constantly bashing into and revealing and getting to know better actually the relationships and the often very uncomfortable, strange and dirty relationships that exist in the world between art, value and money. And so I think that this is where the value of this work sits, and I think the art world is like really uniquely placed to kind of explore this stuff.
I mean, I totally agree with you, because even within the structures of the art world, you've got the market, you've got the institution per se, and your project, I mean, the blockchain itself has definitely been very much more towards being exploited by market interests. But at the same time, I think a lot of what your projects that you've created, and I don't know if you'd agree, seem to be like exploring how to reinvent the idea of how institutions can function in a new way. Is that kind of part of the desire, like the creation of a new institution somehow, or some like, and I'm thinking in like rethinking of what something like a ICA or a Kunstverein could be, but with a kind of a group otherness, a kind of collective way of thinking?
I'm going to say something very short and then hand over to Penny. I think that this is possible, and there are people doing this exact work in this space. I mean, there's Nick Copenhagen producing Kunstverein as a DAO in Germany at the moment. I think for me and at Furtherfield, our kind of primary drive is to apply the kind of commons-based principle that we should be forming our institutions and our economies around cultures. So it's cultures first. So this is behaviors, needs, what it means to thrive together, and to then have those people who have a shared vested interest in this work happening then devise the economies and organizations that they need to operate properly. So, and maybe sometimes that produces institutions, maybe sometimes it produces very temporary institutions, maybe sometimes they're semi-permanent, maybe sometimes they are programmed to have a hard stop in them for some reason. But it's definitely sitting in the realm of a kind of institutional critique, certainly, and to rethink, so it's returning to some of that work.
I'm going to bring up another question, unless you feel something you want to insert there, Penny. Do you want to tell me a little bit, because you had such an amazing breadth of international focus, and I think that's very interesting and something, again, the art world's a little bit slower on in general, or has been pre-pandemic. What differences did you find between some of the issues and thinking that were emerging between international locations here?
I mean, this was pretty fascinating. And I think that this also really kind of leads actually off the previous question and Ruth's answer, because it became like, maybe I will just briefly explain how we got everyone together, just for the audience. So basically, we curated what was known as the Artworld Decentralized Autonomous Organization 52-hour gathering, where we actually brought together this group of people from they were actually from all over, because although they were positioned within the Minsk, Hong Kong, Berlin, and Johannesburg context, but actually what also made up those people was, of course, a strong sense of diversity of nationality, as well as we are mostly translocal beings. But we basically created this 52-hour program where we got everybody together in London, actually almost kind of a year ago now, like the 25th of February. And we created a program that lasted for 52 hours that used these uncanny working methods, where we created a toolkit that was both kind of technical introductions, theory, body work, thinking, talking, and breakaways. And together we would discuss and analyze and map out the kind of obstacles, opportunities, and implications for progressive decentralized art world automation. And in a way, this really started to show us that across the board, there were similarities between these countries. But on the other side, there was fundamentally a very strong, and correct me if I'm reading too much into this, Ruth, but I think there was a very strong interest in, firstly, creating spaces where the right people were in the rooms, like these, as Ruth and Mark would say at Furtherfield, radical friendships. And that fundamentally came first. It was actually a huge pushback normally about almost kind of creating technology that then would be given to somebody to organize their community or so forth. And that was also something that was really strong for us, because we I think it's also very important to say that not all of the people that we invited to this 52-hour gathering were in fact like tech natives, and specifically not DAO tech natives. It was actually a kind of amalgamation of thinkers, artists, theorists, and technologists and conspiracists. And this was also kind of very, I think, important about organizing, firstly, these kind of human economies. And then like whoever was still left in the room, then you could actually start building something. And then you would really understand who your stakeholders are and the relationships and mechanisms and production and of course, market value and motivation. Because like, let's be honest, although these spaces are what we hope human economies, but at the same time, they're not exit strategies. They're like micro nodules that like sit within this world. And in a way, over the course of me working with this project, I began to realize that like literally everything we're doing is about surviving. And that's not just about like surviving the pandemic or surviving capitalism on a whole, but also like concepts and ideas and humanity and non-humanity and diversity as well as tradition, and like how you need to like bring space to discuss and analyze. And that not only were we trying to build these coded organisms, but we were also listening to each other. And I think that there's not enough time that I've had the opportunity to speak to people from across the globe and understand what technology means, what the art world means. What is this in relation to social evolution from a local and global level?
I mean, it's really fascinating. It seemed to be a lot of the discussions were touching on the idea of new value systems. And I find that very interesting, the idea that you seem to be wanting to question what value was, who is allocating value, and how does it reflect their point of view? Because if we think traditionally of how value's been given over the, let's say, the past 500 years, and in the wake of early capitalism, it's been by vested interest in wealth, etc. So it's really interesting that you're kind of actively trying to rethink of the process of giving value, because that's something quite basic, actually. What to like? I mean, we're on social media. What is given value? The number of likes. I found very interesting that your South African group were talking about the idea of voting through emoji, which I found that quite an interesting idea, but maybe the true need for a new language to give something value beyond something purely numeric, which is quite a funny thing to be discussing in the context of technology, which has always been reductive, let's say, to the numeric. So yeah, I'm curious about your did you feel that there was conclusions or progress, or like how that shifting idea of what value could be came through the project?
I mean, I can just answer in like a very short way, and maybe Ruth can follow on. But I mean, I think like the first thing that just kind of rings in my head with that would be like, it had to become more than just utility. Like, by positioning value, it needed to speak to others and be spoken to. And I know that sounds fairly esoteric, so maybe Ruth, you can go on.
It's such a big question. that it kind of, an answer will slip in and out of my mind. But I think there are so many ways to come at this. I think if we think of the ensemble DAO, I think what we saw in the discussion of a DAO inspired by improvised group, group improvised music process, I think what we see is the values attached both to expertise, to specific events, and to specific events that are both musical, some that are really social and not specifically to do with music, and actually trying to think about how those things are valued in the moment, like how we capture the value of that, how we think about it in the moment, how we record what's happened, how we record that and use that as a basis to decide on future actions. It's like this kind of forensics of value in human relationship is what we see there. And actually you can do this kind of analysis of each of the DAO prototypes and you get a different sense of how value is being understood and rethought.
I mean, it's also very interesting. That's another question to think of in relationship to DAO within an art context. How do you feel that these organizations or the prototypes of these organizations or the possibility of DAOs sit with the kind of history and practices of art collectives and that kind of way of making? Because I remember, I think in one of them, Penny, you describe DAOs as a form of manifesto somehow. And yeah, I'm really curious to think of the relationship between art collectives, which is quite a fundamental part, particularly in the 20th century, actually, but even before that, and how these DAOs are functioning. Was there any comparisons or connections there for you?
I jump in here. So I've been pretty kind of captivated by the idea of the DAO as an executable artist manifesto, because I think it does this thing of being able to record past actions and use them as a basis for what we will mobilize next together. So it's this way of kind of seeing ourselves together and to then use that as a template to share and to make and to kind of automate the kind of continuance of that in different places and customization of that in different places. But I think that there's also this relationship with a whole load of systems art practice and cybernetic art practice. So I was in preparation for this interview, I was thinking like who are really good kind of who have been my role models, because I'm quite obsessed with systems art. And I think Adrian Piper's probable trust registry is a really excellent precursor, or actually it kind of was, I think it was at MoMA a couple of years ago. So this is a work where audiences turn up and they sign their name on a piece of paper, but they sign up knowing that their name will be distributed only to other people who also signed up at the end of the exhibition, and they will never be shared with anyone but the gallery. And I think this feels, it's all these kind of like little mechanisms for tying people together in particular kinds of relations are really interesting. And then the other person I thought of was Steve Willatz and his kind of, I don't know if you know, like all these cybernetic works that are really an analysis of people's attention and participation and the different ways in which people are motivated to act together or against each other or in loops and to pattern behavior and all this kind of thing.
I'm going to bring it to another question, which actually is going back to the kind of the blockchain aspect of DAOs. And transparency is always something that's really reiterated as something fundamental within how the blockchain functions and why it's so appealing. How do you feel that focus on transparency was being used in the proposals, and do you feel that was relevant, and if so, why?
I mean, I think that firstly, I would say that there is times we need transparency, and then I fundamentally agree there's also times we do not. So I just want to put that out first and foremost. Ruth, you can agree or disagree with that. But I think that in regards to the argument of transparency now, I think it comes back to decades and decades of mistrust and abuse that is basically brought us to a kind of ultimatum of existing. And I think that's why transparency is such a hot topic in relation to the demand. And from another, maybe more optimistic version, I think that by enabling transparency, you also begin to see patterns and systems. And you begin to have a broader understanding of what you're working with, because you can see it from multiple different angles rather than your own personal perception, which actually does offer something fundamental in the brokering of creating an architecture of building, especially when that comes to the collective on a whole. And I just want to speak, because I think that it's quite maybe known, this the idea of transparency on the blockchain or transparency through information. But I also want to try to bring in another type of transparency of working together that became very important, I think, for us, particularly within this program over that year, was also transparency of you, what you were bringing into this moment at that time. For example, when we did the work with this 52-hour think tank, and we'd actually done another one previously that was just a group of peers, but we started and closed every session where people could just speak about what they were feeling and bringing that into the collective room. And I think that these are all models of trying to get out of the individual singular view of, because we all make mistakes in reading our environment. We also make mistakes in our behavior and not understanding it. So of course it's very important for me to go into a meeting with Ruth if she tells me that she had a wonderful day, or if she tells me she had a shitty day and she's been in hundreds of Zoom calls. Then I read all of her answers, understanding the background of where those answers are coming from. And that means if Ruth's a bit sharp with me, I actually know Ruth's not being sharp with me. And I think that I'm in a roundabout way trying to explain transparency through a human concept. But it's also because I think that we should always read technology as the proxy of the human body. And I think that's also was very important to the exercise and the projects itself of creating these prototypes, was also again to bring technology onto human systems and our body, rather than just kind of seeing it as an Excel or something like that. I had another reason why I wanted to talk about transparency.
That's a really good one.
Which is floating off, and I keep rambling on.
Because I'm burst. This topic makes I realise I'm bursting with things to say about transparency, and so this is one area in which I'm super convinced of the value that artists bring to the technical space, because I think technical development spaces do many things really brilliantly, and they bring focus to things really brilliantly sometimes and enable certain things to happen. But on the topic of transparency, artists are doing really important work on recomplicating and kind of thickening the ideas of transparency. I think through the work on the DAOs, we've got this a very strong sensibility developing of things that you would and wouldn't put into a piece of software because of what it would do to the individuals or the group itself. And so, like, very simply, the transparency that blockchain does is that it keeps a permanent record of an exchange. That's it. That's the bit of transparency. But if we think of transparency for humans and human societies, it has so many different layers to it. And I think it's an area that deserves a lot of thought and experimentation and work, especially thinking about what it means, the shift from web to blockchain. So the situation we have at the moment, so ideas of transparency are tied up with kind of privacy and surveillance on the opposite side. And what we have in the web, for instance, at the moment, is a situation where we have effectively no transparency about how our data is being used. So people are lulled into a horribly false sense of security about what can be known about them and for how long and by whom. And there's something so horrifying to most normal people about the idea that any exchange they have might be recorded by somebody somewhere forever and that will never be taken away, that I think that it's at moments like, it's when we think about transparency on the blockchain that it actually helps us to think more critically and to become more uncomfortable about the lives that we are living in network space, and to think again more carefully about in whose interest these spaces are built, and maybe to adjust our behaviours and to demand different politics because of that.
I'm going to bring in a slight curveball, which is looking at the relationship between DAOs and cryptocurrency, which is something, as your week is proving, there are a lot of positive and negatives about the relationship between, well, I mean, or the experience of crypto at all. And I wanted to know how you felt those things were intersecting in positive or negative ways, like what some of that role was together.
I'm going to do a very blunt version. So in the kind of crypto art space, we are seeing art as finance. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing art as like entirely through the narrative of finance.
It's like that at art fairs too.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It's just money laundering, essentially. It's commodity trading a lot of the time.
So it's I think we're seeing, and so there's kind of outrage actually, and I think we're also seeing a kind of internecine war going on between those of us that went to art school and that kind of have a sense of art as a kind of involving institutional critique or societal critique and conceptual space, and then those that didn't, for whom so maybe commercial artists, graphic artists who have had their work used, stolen and exploited for like since the web, especially digital work, mm-hmm. who are actually genuinely seeing this as a way potentially to at last make a living. So and that also then there's a real struggle for these two groups of people to talk to each other and to find a way to talk to each other and to find any common ground and frankly any mutual respect. So this is really hot at the moment. And then on the other side with the DAOs, so one of the things that I do have a problem with in the kind of crypto art hype is this idea that it's kind of heralding a democratization of finance, or a democratization of culture. It isn't. It might be heralding, possibly, arguably, a democratization of finance, like we can all now be speculators and traders, but I fear for a lot of people, and it's really messy.
And let's be honest, the access to technology is in no way democratic.
No, I mean,
and certainly not in a global perspective.
Yeah, and there's a whole conversation this conversation we're having, the tip of the iceberg conversation. But on the other side, the work with DAOs that I think has gripped Penny and I and the people we've been working with is the democratization of governance design. So how you build processes where people are designing the way they would like to organize their lives together. And questions of ownership come into that, but questions of how we coordinate and decide the things we share, the things we don't share. This to me feels like a really urgent conversation for us to be having. It's very frustrating to me. I don't know if it is to Penny, that like basically the conversation, like try and get any art event into the news, unless it's about money, it's not news.
Yeah, but I mean, I would say that
news about art is about money. And so I just think that this is, I think this is why there's this big struggle at the moment to process what's going on, is because one of the things that the crypto art scene is bubbling up is the realization of just how deeply co-opted all of the art world space already is by financialized processes, like right across the board. And it's painful. It's painful for us all to come to terms with this.
I'm going to ask a final question because we're almost out of time, but that would be talk about the publication that you're creating and how that's coming together to capture a lot of this information. Obviously, there's a lot on the Goethe-Institut website, including the past conversations. But yeah, how is the publication going to function for you both?
Well, I mean, this has been like also, I think, in a way, I'm also almost like now newly thinking of this publication somehow like within the lens of like a ledger in blockchain. It's just like basically storing our thoughts and conversations and exchanges, because I think it's also extremely important to say that the publication has, in a way, it's a toolkit, but it's also a reader. It's like a manifesto. It's a manual. It's a meditation. It's a magic system in a way, because there's, of course, there's two of us in front of you right now, Fran, but this is like a huge web of information and reflection. And
contributors as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so basically we tried to create something that reflected that. And we know that, or we hope anyway, that this reader would be forked. It would be built upon and rejected. And we really see that this kind of book that we've been compiling is really just kind of the beginning, or at least like the foundation of, I guess, bringing this to like a broader potential in other people's lives. But basically we started to try to compile this, working with like tools, interviews, models. Each chapter of the book focuses on a kind of vein or theme of the contemporary being. And in a way, it kind of breaks it down, moving from a kind of meta to a present now, in models and goals. Actually, we were like really deeply inspired by Simone Weil's Gravity and Grace, which was actually like published posthumously. She's a mystic philosopher. But more about the book. But so we actually will be covering different topics, like who has the authority to make reality, cultures before structures, social landscapes, not rooms with views, translocality, the money monster, of course, can't forget that one, alongside the mechanism monster, similarly invoking. And I guess really like fundamentally, it's about decentralization, distribution, and living systems. And we've come to think of it as sort of open sourcing the philosopher's stone.
It's a beautiful conclusion. And can I say how refreshing it is to speak to a female panel on this subject. I think this is the first time that's ever happened to me, and gosh, it's refreshing. And I'm going to say thank you so much. I hope everyone watching has enjoyed and asked questions if they have them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thanks, Fran. And I just want to, because we haven't thanked formally, Estella at Digital Nomad and Studio Height, who've done the visual design for the whole DAOWO series, and of course the wonderful team at the Goethe-Institut. Now, we said we would aim for 40 minutes. We've really gone over that, but we are going to, in the YouTube channel, we will be hanging out and continuing to chat for a little while, for as long as people have the appetite. So yeah, thank you so much, Fran. Thank you, Dee.
Yes, amazing interpreting.
Yeah.
Bye.